I put my $50,000 savings in my mom's safe, but when I needed it for surgery, she laughed and said, "You should have thought about that before you got fat." I cried in the driveway, and my aunt whispered, "You need to know what really happened in '98. That changed everything." I trusted my mom with my life savings because she had a huge old safe bolted into her basement. And I wanted to save for a medical/weight related. When I finally needed the money, she basically told me she wasn't giving it back and insulted me. While I was falling apart outside, my aunt pulled me aside and told me something about my family that completely changed my understanding of everything. I feel so betrayed and confused. I always thought my family was weird but basically decent. I grew up in Helena, Montana, in this weather-beaten house that had been in our family for decades. My mom, Marjorie, was the kind of woman who had no patience for what she called weakness, whether it was crying, asking for help, or showing emotion at all. My brother Owen was her favorite. I always felt like the spare kid, the one she tolerated but never really saw. I stayed close to home after high school, bouncing between jobs. College didn't feel possible at the time, and honestly, I didn't have the energy to fight for something better. Years passed. I gained a lot of weight, dealt with depression, and eventually decided I wanted to take control of my life. The first step was getting surgery, something my doctors and therapist both supported. I started saving every dollar I could. No vacations, no eating out, no new clothes. I lived with roommates, drove an old Corolla, and cut coupons like my life depended on it. After almost 7 years, I had $50,000 saved, enough for the surgery, travel, time off work, and a bit of a safety net afterward. I didn't trust banks because of a mess I had with identity theft years ago. My mom had this enormous, ancient safe in her basement, hidden behind a fake wall panel. It was fireproof, floodproof, and frankly looked like it could survive a nuclear blast. When she offered to keep my money there, I didn't hesitate. She was my mom. Who thinks their mom would steal from them? The plan was simple: when the time came, I'd ask for it back, and everything would move forward. When I got the call from the clinic that they could schedule me in 2 months, I was over the moon. I drove straight to my mom's house, barely able to sit still from excitement. I sat at the kitchen table while she made herself coffee, heart pounding in my chest. "Hey, so it's time," I said, smiling. "I'm scheduled for surgery. I need the money by Friday for the hospital deposit." She didn't sit down. She just stirred her coffee, took a long sip, and without even looking at me, said, "You should have thought about that before you got fat." At first, I thought I misunderstood her. I laughed nervously and repeated myself, thinking maybe she didn't hear me right. But she just shrugged and said, like it was the most casual thing in the world, "There's no money, Kendra. It's gone." I felt my stomach drop so fast I thought I might pass out. I kept my voice even, struggling to stay calm. "Mom, what do you mean it's gone? That was my life savings. You said you'd keep it safe." She turned around finally, setting her cup down harder than necessary. "You spent your life making bad choices. Eating too much, not taking care of yourself. Now you want me to enable more of it? Grow up." I sat there stunned, my mouth hanging open. I couldn't even find words. She just walked away like the conversation was over. I stumbled out into the driveway, feeling like the world was spinning around me. I sat down on the curb, pulled my knees to my chest, and started crying harder than I have in years. I didn't care who saw. Everything I had worked for was gone. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, I heard footsteps. I looked up and saw my Aunt Deborah standing there, her face full of something between pity and guilt. "Come with me," she said quietly. I didn't ask where we were going. I didn't care. I just followed her to her car and climbed into the passenger seat. We drove in silence to a little diner on the edge of town. The waitress brought us coffees without us even ordering. Deborah just sat there staring into hers for a long time before she finally spoke. "Kendra, you need to know something," she said. "Something your mother's been hiding for a long time. She told me that back in 1998, my dad hadn't just abandoned us like Mom always said. He had discovered that Mom had been stealing from him for years, funneling his paychecks into secret accounts. She was planning to divorce him and wanted to keep everything: the house, the land, even his pension. When he found out, he confronted her. Instead of admitting it, she called the police and accused him of domestic violence. There were no bruises. No evidence. But she was clever. She made sure she looked scared enough when the cops arrived. After that, Dad tried fighting the charges, but the legal fees drained him. In the end, he just left Montana with nothing because he couldn't afford to keep fighting her lies. Deborah had tried to stand up for him, but Mom shut her out too. Deborah said Mom made sure the entire family thought Dad was some deadbeat monster who abandoned his kids. Hearing it was like having the floor ripped out from under me. I had spent 25 years believing my dad didn't love me. I had blamed him for everything: the loneliness, the financial struggles, the emptiness. And it was all a lie. My hand shook as I sipped my coffee. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Deborah reached into her purse and slid an envelope across the table. Inside were photocopies of old court records, letters from my dad to Deborah, and most shocking of all, an address. Dad was alive. Living in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, just a few hours away. I felt like I couldn't breathe. How do you process losing your mother in the same moment you realize you might still have a father? I didn't sleep much after that night. My mind raced in circles, looping through everything Deborah had told me, wondering how I could have been so blind. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was the realization that my entire foundation had been cracked and rotting for years, and I hadn't even noticed. Deborah offered to drive with me to Coeur d'Alene, but I said no. I needed to do it alone. It felt like something I had to face on my own terms. The next morning, I packed a small bag, left a note for my roommate, and started the 4-hour drive. The Montana plains gave way to pine trees and winding roads, but I barely noticed the scenery. My heart was hammering the whole time. I didn't even know if he would want to see me. I kept preparing myself for every possibility: that he might slam the door in my face, that he might not even recognize me. Maybe he had started a new family and wanted to forget the old one. Maybe I was nothing more than a painful memory to him. I found the house easily. It was small, a little worn around the edges, with a front porch that sagged slightly. There were flower boxes under the windows, half filled with scraggly marigolds. It looked humble. Quiet. For a long time I just sat there in my car, staring. Finally, I got out and walked up the driveway, my knees wobbling. Before I could even knock, the front door opened. An older man stepped onto the porch. His hair was mostly gray, his face lined and weathered, but there was something about him, the shape of his eyes, the way he tilted his head, that felt achingly familiar. He squinted at me, confused at first, and then something in his expression softened. "Kendra," he said, voice rough with disbelief. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. I just nodded. He stepped forward like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to touch me. And then, after a painful pause, he pulled me into a hug. It wasn't a long hug. It was awkward, stiff. We both didn't know how to do this. But it was real. Inside, his house was simple. A recliner, a battered coffee table, a TV. Family pictures lined the walls, but none of me or Owen. It hurt, but I understood why. He made coffee and we sat in the living room, the conversation slow and halting at first. He told me about the years after he left, how he had tried to get in touch, how he had sent letters and gifts that were all returned or lost. "Your mother made sure I was a ghost," he said bitterly. I believed him. After what I had seen from her, there wasn't a doubt in my mind. He asked about my life, and I told him the truth, that it hadn't been easy, that I had spent most of it feeling abandoned and unworthy. His hand shook as he listened. Every now and then, he wiped at his eyes, pretending it was just dust. He didn't apologize in the way movies teach you to expect. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He just sat there, heartbroken, and listened. And somehow, that was enough. We spent hours talking. When I finally left, he hugged me again, tighter this time, and told me I was always welcome. Driving back to Helena, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. I hadn't gotten my money back. I hadn't fixed the years we lost. But something had shifted inside me. I wasn't alone anymore. When I got home, I found that my mother had left me several voicemails. At first they were angry, accusing me of being ungrateful, of being dramatic. Then they turned pitiful, filled with fake tears and guilt-tripping. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to talk to her. I didn't know if I ever would be. Instead, I called Deborah and told her everything. She cried when I told her how the meeting went. "You have more family than you thought," she said. "We just weren't allowed to be near you before." In the weeks that followed, I moved out of my shared apartment and into a tiny studio in Missoula to be closer to better job opportunities. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I started the loan process to finance my surgery. It was humiliating, knowing that I had already earned the money once and was being forced to borrow it now, but it was a step forward. A painful one, but forward all the same. Mom showed up at my work one afternoon, something I had dreaded since everything blew up. She stood there at the front counter, looking somehow both furious and desperate. "We need to talk," she hissed under her breath. I told my manager I needed a break and stepped outside with her, my stomach churning. She didn't apologize. Not really. She said things like, "I only wanted what was best for you, and you're so ungrateful after everything I've done." I stood there, arms crossed, letting her words fall flat. When she realized she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted, she switched tactics. "I'm your mother," she said. "You're supposed to take care of me." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I said, "You're right. You're my mother. And you were supposed to protect me." The silence after that was deafening. She turned and walked away, and I let her. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty for standing up for myself. After that confrontation outside my work, something in me hardened. It wasn't anger, not really. It was more like acceptance. I finally saw my mother for who she really was. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. I threw myself into preparing for surgery. It wasn't easy. The loan took weeks to process, and the interest rates made my stomach churn, but I kept telling myself that moving forward was better than standing still, rotting in bitterness. Deborah helped more than I could have ever asked. She drove me to appointments when I was too stressed to drive myself, sat with me in waiting rooms, made me laugh when all I wanted to do was cry. My dad, it still felt strange to call him that again, checked in every few days. Sometimes it was just a text, sometimes a short call where we mostly talked about nothing. But it meant the world. It was like watering something that had been bone dry for decades and watching it start to bloom. One Saturday morning about a month before my surgery date, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick up. It was Owen. Hearing his voice brought up a complicated rush of emotions. We hadn't spoken in almost a year, and even before that, our conversations were stiff and awkward. "Hey," he said, casual, like we hadn't been raised in a house full of quiet landmines. "Mom told me you're spreading lies about her." I sat down heavily on the edge of my bed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "I'm not getting into this with you," I said. "She's our mom, Kendra," he said, and there was something sharp underneath the words. "She's not perfect, but she did her best." I almost laughed. His best was different than mine. He had always been the favored one. He got the softer voice, the second chances. I got the cold stares and impossible expectations. "Maybe she did her best for you," I said quietly. "She took everything from me." "You're being dramatic." There it was. The family motto. Before he could say more, I told him I had to go and hung up. I sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the wall. Part of me wanted to scream, to call him back and unload decades of hurt. But a bigger part of me, the part one was just starting to trust, knew it wouldn't change anything. Owen was still trapped inside her web. Maybe he always would be. 2 weeks before surgery, Dad came to visit. It was awkward at first. He wasn't sure if he should hug me when he walked in, so we sort of did this weird half-hug, half-pat thing that made us both laugh nervously. He brought a shoebox filled with old photos. Pictures of me as a baby, missing teeth and ponytails, pictures of Owen riding bikes, even one of all four of us smiling at the county fair. I stared at the photos for a long time, feeling like I was seeing ghosts. "I kept everything," he said, voice thick. "Even when I couldn't keep you." I wanted to tell him it was okay. I wanted to say I understood. But the words got stuck in my throat. Instead, I hugged him. A real hug this time. He stayed for a few days, helping me set up my apartment so it would be easier after surgery. He fixed the leaking faucet, installed a grab bar in the bathroom, even built me a little shelf for my books. I hadn't realized how much I missed having someone look out for me. Not control me. Not manipulate me. Just care. The night before he left, we sat on my tiny balcony watching the sunset over Missoula. The mountains turned pink and gold in the distance. "I missed too much," he said suddenly. "I can't ever get that back." I shook my head. "You're here now," I said. He smiled, a small, sad smile, and for the first time, I realized that healing wasn't about pretending the past didn't happen. It was about building something better in spite of it. The surgery date crept closer. I wasn't just anxious about the operation itself, I was terrified that somehow, something would go wrong again. That I would be punished for daring to want a better life. The day before surgery, I got another letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope made my stomach drop. It was from my mother. I thought about throwing it away without opening it. I stood there by the trash can, letter trembling in my hands, for a full 5 minutes. But curiosity won out. The letter was 3 pages long, front and back, filled with long, rambling justifications. She didn't apologize. Not once. Instead, she listed everything she had done for me, all the sacrifices she made, how disappointed she was that I had turned against her. At the bottom of the 3rd page, she wrote, "You owe me everything you are." I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into the bottom drawer of my nightstand. I didn't need to carry it anymore. The next morning, Deborah drove me to the hospital. I watched the world blur past the window, my heart hammering, my mind filled with all the versions of myself I was trying to leave behind. When we pulled into the parking garage, Deborah turned to me and squeezed my hand. "You've already survived worse than this," she said. And somehow, I believed her. The surgery itself went smoothly, but the recovery was cruel. There were days I regretted everything. The pain, the swelling, the fear that maybe I had made a mistake. Some nights I woke up sobbing, overwhelmed by the changes happening in my body and in my life. But Deborah was always there, bringing homemade soups, driving me to follow-up appointments, sitting with me through long, heavy silences when I didn't have words for what I was feeling. And my dad, he called every evening, sometimes just to listen to me breathe when I didn't have the strength to talk. Little by little, I got stronger. I started walking again. At first just from the bed to the bathroom, then to the mailbox, then around the block. Every step felt like a tiny rebellion against the years of self-loathing I had been taught to swallow. Months passed. I lost weight. But more importantly, I shed layers of fear and shame that had weighed me down longer than the extra pounds ever did. Mom tried reaching out a few more times. Texts, emails, even sending Owen to talk some sense into me. I ignored them all. I wasn't ready to let her back into my life. If I was honest, I didn't think I ever would be. One afternoon, I was sitting in a little coffee shop, catching up on some freelance work on my laptop, when I overheard a conversation at the next table that made me freeze. It was about a local community scholarship fund, a private grant meant to help low-income families with medical expenses, run by none other than Marjorie herself. I remembered her bragging about it once, years ago. How it made her look good. How it boosted her standing in the community. An idea started forming in my mind. Not cruel. Not violent. Just justice. I went home and started digging. Public records, nonprofit filings, community board minutes. It didn't take long to find the cracks. The scholarship fund was real, but the way it was managed was sloppy at best and borderline fraudulent at worst. There were missing reports, suspicious expenses, and hardly any documentation about where the money was actually going. I compiled everything carefully. Documented it all. And then I submitted an anonymous tip to the local newspaper. I also sent copies to the community board that oversaw grants like this, and the state's nonprofit regulation office. I didn't expect anything to happen right away. I knew these things moved slowly. But when it started, it was like watching a dam break. Within a few weeks, whispers turned into articles. Articles turned into investigations. Suddenly, Marjorie's name wasn't glowing in the community anymore. Suddenly, the town she had spent decades manipulating began to see her for what she really was. The scholarship fund was frozen. A formal audit was launched. Her seat on the local community board, gone. Her reputation, shredded. I watched it all unfold from a distance, sipping coffee with a quiet, private satisfaction. It wasn't revenge in the way movies show it. No big public confrontation, no shouting matches. Just the simple, cold unveiling of the truth. The same truth she had buried for decades. Owen called again during all of this. This time, his voice wasn't angry, it was scared. "Why are you doing this to her?" he asked. I almost felt sorry for him. He still didn't understand. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "The truth is doing it." He didn't call again after that. Meanwhile, my life started to finally bloom. I took on more freelance work, enough to afford a better apartment. I joined a hiking group, something I never would have dared before, and even made a few real friends for the first time in years. And my dad, he came to visit often. We didn't talk much about the past anymore. We didn't need to. We were too busy building something new. Something better. The final twist came about a year later. Deborah called me, practically vibrating with excitement. "Guess what?" she said. "The community board's starting a new scholarship fund to replace your mother's. And they want someone new on the board. Someone with real experience. Someone who's lived through it." I laughed, heart pounding. "They offered it to you?" I asked. She laughed too. "No, Kendra. They offered it to you." At first, I said no. It felt too big. Too scary. But Deborah just smiled and said, "Maybe it's time you stop letting fear make your decisions." I thought about it long and hard. And finally, I said yes. Standing in front of that small community board months later, shaking hands, being trusted, it was surreal. I wasn't the fat, broken girl hiding behind everyone else anymore. I was Kendra. Survivor. Builder. Daughter, to the people who chose to love me, not the ones who demanded it. And the best part? Mom got to watch it all happen. From the sidelines. Helpless. Silent. Exactly where she put me for so many years. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small or scared or angry. I just felt free.